Case 1, Natalie Finn, West Des Moines, 2016. My sister collapsed. The voice on the other end of the 911 call was flat, emotionless. No panic, no tears. Just 4 words delivered like a weather report. The dispatcher asked follow-up questions, but the boy's tone never changed. He sounded detached, hollow, like he'd been drained of everything that makes a person human. Paramedics raced to the Brick Ranch home in West Des Moines, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Polk County where families mowed their lawns and kids rode bikes down tree-lined streets. When they burst through the door, they found her, Natalie Finn, 16 years old, lying motionless on the floor. They started CPR immediately, hands moving fast, voices urgent. But the moment they touched her body, they knew. She was cold. Her skin had already started to change color. Natalie hadn't just collapsed. She'd been dead for a while. 81 pounds, that's what Natalie weighed when she died. Let that sink in for a second. 16 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall. She should have weighed around 125 pounds. Instead, she weighed 81. Her body mass index was 13.1. Severe malnutrition, the kind of starvation you see in famine zones, not middle-class Iowa. Her heart simply gave out. Cardiac arrest secondary to prolonged starvation. She didn't collapse. She shut down. So how does a 16-year-old girl starve to death in the United States in 2016? How does a teenager waste away to nothing in a house with a fully stocked kitchen, running water, and 2 adults who were supposed to protect her? The answer is simple, and it's sickening. Nicole Finn and Joseph Finn, Natalie's adoptive parents, locked her up and let her die. Investigators walked through that West Des Moines home and found a prison. Not a bedroom, a prison. Natalie and her 4 adopted siblings had been confined to a back bedroom that had been systematically stripped of everything that makes a room livable. The windows had been nailed shut with 2x4s hammered into the frames so the children couldn't escape or call for help. The carpet had been ripped out, leaving bare concrete floors, cold, hard, unforgiving. There was no furniture, no beds, no blankets, except for a few urine-soaked rags crumpled in the corner. A paint bucket sat in the middle of the room. That was their toilet. Food and water were withheld for extended periods. When Nicole Finn decided to feed them, she didn't use plates or bowls. She threw scraps on the concrete floor like they were animals. Sometimes she gave them nothing at all. The neighbors knew. They saw Natalie. In the months before her death, she had been spotted knocking on doors, barefoot, emaciated, her clothes hanging off her skeletal frame. She asked for bread. She asked for fruit. She asked for anything. One neighbor later told investigators that Natalie looked like a concentration camp victim. Another said she seemed scared, like she was sneaking out and knew she'd be punished if she was caught. But no one called the police. No one intervened. They gave her food, closed the door, and went back to their lives. And Natalie went back to that room. When detectives seized Nicole Finn's phone, they found over 5,300 pages of text messages exchanged with Joseph Finn, her ex-husband. The two had divorced, but they stayed in constant communication about the children, and what they said in those messages was nothing short of monstrous. They are worthless. I cannot stand them. Natalie needs to go, and now. That last message was sent after Natalie had been seen by neighbors asking for food. Nicole Finn wasn't worried about her daughter's health. She was worried about getting caught, and her solution wasn't to feed Natalie. It was to make her disappear. The texts also revealed that Nicole and Joseph had discussed fabricating stories to tell investigators from the Iowa Department of Human Services. They knew DHS had been getting reports. They knew people were asking questions, and they were coordinating lies to cover their tracks. Here's the part that makes your blood boil. Between 2005 and 2016, 14 child abuse reports were filed about the Finn household. 14. 5 of those reports came in just the final 6 months of Natalie's life. Between November 2015 and May 2016, school officials filed reports describing Natalie as starving and very thin. Teachers saw her, counselors saw her. People who worked with children every single day saw the signs and reported them. And do you know how many of those reports were actually investigated? 1. The Iowa Ombudsman's Office later released a scathing 160-page report detailing catastrophic systemic failures within DHS, procedural errors, inadequate staffing, poor record-keeping. Reports that should have triggered immediate welfare checks were improperly rejected or lost in the shuffle. A DHS social worker named Amy Sacco had been assigned to investigate a report in May 2016, just 5 months before Natalie died. She mishandled the case so badly she was fired. 4 other staff members received coaching. The ombudsman made 14 recommendations for reform, but none of that brought Natalie back. Nicole Finn was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping, child endangerment resulting in death, child endangerment causing serious injury, and neglect of a dependent person. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece: the boarded windows, the starvation, the text messages, the lies. The defense tried to paint Nicole as overwhelmed, struggling, mentally unwell, but the jury saw through it. On December 14, 2017, after deliberating the facts and the horror of what had been done to Natalie and her siblings, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty, on every single count. In January 2018, the judge handed down the sentence: 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Nicole Finn will never walk free again. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, in a cell, isolated from the world, just like she did to Natalie. Joseph Finn, Natalie's adoptive father, was also charged with 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping, child endangerment, causing serious injury, and neglect of a dependent person. He took a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Natalie Finn should be 25 years old today. She should be finishing college, starting a career, maybe falling in love. Instead, she's buried in a cemetery, a victim of 2 people who were supposed to love her and failed in every possible way. If this case shook you, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started. 10 mothers, 10 unforgivable crimes, and they're never walking free again. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Case 2, Yemissi Nadege Keto Waukee, 2023. The smell hit them the moment the door opened. Bleach, not the faint, clean scent you get after mopping the kitchen. This was overpowering, chemical, burning your nostrils strong, the kind of smell that makes your eyes water and your throat close up. Police officers in Waukee, Iowa, had responded to a welfare check at an apartment complex on August 31, 2023. A neighbor had called, saying they hadn't seen the woman or her baby in days and were worried. When officers stepped inside, the bleach fumes were so intense they had to pause and brace themselves before going further. They found him in the bedroom. 1-year-old DK, his name protected by court order, was lying motionless on the floor. His small body was surrounded by open bottles of bleach and cleaning chemicals, some tipped over, liquid pooling on the carpet around him. The officers knew immediately. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic mistake. This was something far worse. DK was gone. Standing nearby, eerily calm, was 26-year-old Yemissi Nadege Keto, his mother. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't ask if her son was okay or beg the officers to help him. She just stood there, silent, staring at the floor, her face blank. Officers tried speaking to her in English, but she didn't respond. She was a French-speaking immigrant, and communication was nearly impossible. They called for an interpreter. What happened next, what Keto told them through that interpreter, was one of the most chilling confessions investigators had ever heard. She didn't deny it. She didn't make excuses. She walked them through it, step by step, like she was describing how to bake a cake. Keto said she had poured bleach and cleaning liquid directly onto DK's face. She wanted him to pass out quickly, she explained. She thought the chemicals would render him unconscious so he wouldn't suffer. But it didn't work that way. DK didn't pass out. Instead, he started crying, screaming, thrashing, his skin burning, his lungs filling with toxic fumes, his little body fighting for air. So she covered his nose and mouth with her hand. She held her hand over his airway, pressing down, keeping it there while he struggled beneath her palm. She held it there until he stopped moving, until he stopped breathing, until he was dead. Then she stepped back, surrounded his body with bottles of bleach, and waited. The medical examiner's report confirmed every horrifying detail. DK had chemical burns on his face, around his nose and mouth, and down his airway. The bleach had seared his delicate skin, eating through tissue, leaving marks that told the story of what his final moments had been like. But the bleach didn't kill him. The suffocation did. The cause of death was listed as suffocation exacerbated by chemical exposure. Waukee isn't a place where you expect horror like this. It's quiet, suburban, safe. It's the kind of town where people move to raise families, where kids ride bikes to school and neighbors wave from their front porches. But behind closed doors, evil doesn't need a zip code. It doesn't care if you live in a big city or a small town. It finds its way in, and when it does, the results are devastating. Keto was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death. As the case moved toward trial, her defense team began building a strategy centered on mental health. They argued that Keto had been suffering from severe psychiatric issues, untreated and undiagnosed. They painted a picture of a woman who was isolated, alone in a foreign country, struggling to communicate, overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood, and spiraling into a mental health crisis that she had no resources to manage. The defense didn't deny that Keto had killed her son. They couldn't. She had confessed. The evidence was undeniable. Instead, they argued that she hadn't been in her right mind when she did it. They claimed she didn't understand the nature of her actions, that she was so deep in delusion and despair that she couldn't distinguish right from wrong. Under Iowa law, that's the standard for an insanity defense. You have to prove that at the time of the crime, the defendant was unable to understand what they were doing or couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong because of a mental defect or illness. It's a high bar. And in Keto's case, the jury didn't buy it. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that Keto had taken deliberate steps. She had gathered the bleach bottles. She had poured the chemicals intentionally. When that didn't work, she made a choice, a conscious, intentional choice, to cover DK's nose and mouth until he suffocated. Those actions, the state argued, showed planning, decision-making, and awareness. She knew what she was doing. She knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway. The trial took place in March 2024. Witnesses testified. Experts were called. The interpreter who had been present during Keto's confession took the stand and recounted, word for word, what she had said. The medical examiner explained the injuries, the burns, the suffocation. The defense presented mental health experts who talked about isolation, language barriers, postpartum struggles, and untreated psychiatric conditions. But in the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. They found Yemissi Nadege Keto guilty on all counts, first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death. In April 2024, the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Keto will never leave prison. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, her days measured in the same suffocating isolation she inflicted on her son. How had a mother, a woman who should have been the one person DK could trust, become the person who ended his life in such a brutal, agonizing way? Community leaders, social service agencies, and local officials scrambled to find answers and prevent it from ever happening again. The city launched a series of reforms aimed at helping immigrant families, particularly those who might be struggling in silence. Interpreter protocols were strengthened to ensure non-English-speaking parents could access crisis intervention resources. Mental health hotlines were promoted in multiple languages, with flyers distributed in apartment complexes across the city. Outreach programs were expanded, with social workers making proactive contact with isolated families, checking in, offering support, and connecting them to resources before a crisis reached a breaking point. But none of that could save DK. He was 1 year old. He should be starting preschool now, learning his colors, playing with toys, laughing. Instead, he's gone, killed by the one person who was supposed to protect him, and his mother will never walk free again. Case 3. Sterling Koehn, Alta Vista, 2017. The baby swing was still running. That's what law enforcement officers noticed first when they entered the apartment in Alta Vista, Iowa on August 30, 2017. The mechanical hum of the swing, rocking back and forth, like everything was normal, like a parent had just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. But nothing about this scene was normal. 4-month-old Sterling Koehn was slumped in that swing, his tiny body cold and lifeless, and crawling all over him, on his clothes, in the folds of his diaper, across his skin, were maggots, hundreds of them, moving, writhing, feeding. The officers froze. Veteran cops who had seen car wrecks, overdoses, and violent crimes stood there, struggling to process what they were looking at. This wasn't a crime scene you could compartmentalize or file away neatly in your mind. This was a level of neglect so severe, so incomprehensible, that it broke something inside everyone who witnessed it. Imagine walking into that apartment. The smell, rotting flesh, human waste, decay, so thick you could taste it. The sight of those maggots moving across a baby's body. The realization that this baby sat there, dying slowly, while his parents walked past him every single day. They saw him, they heard him cry, until he didn't anymore. And they did nothing. The room was filled with trash, dirty laundry and filth piled so high it was hard to navigate. But here's what made it even worse. On the shelves, within arm's reach of where Sterling sat dying, were unopened cans of formula, stacked neatly, ready to use. And on the floor, still in plastic wrapping, were unused packages of diapers. Everything Sterling needed to survive was right there. His parents just couldn't be bothered. Investigators called in Dr. Timothy Huntington, a forensic entomologist, a specialist who studies insects to determine timelines in criminal cases. Dr. Huntington examined the maggots found on Sterling's body and in his diaper. He measured their size, studied their development stages, and analyzed the environmental conditions of the apartment. His findings were damning. The maggots had been developing for 9 to 14 days. Let me repeat that, 9 to 14 days. That means Sterling had been sitting in that swing, in that diaper, neglected and alone, for up to 2 weeks. And here's the most horrifying part. Those maggots didn't just appear after Sterling died. They began developing while he was still alive, while his heart was still beating, while he could still feel pain. The medical examiner's report confirmed what investigators already suspected. Sterling died from a combination of severe dehydration, malnutrition, and an E. coli infection caused by the diaper that had been left on him for nearly 2 weeks. His skin had broken down from prolonged exposure to urine and feces. The bacteria from his own waste had entered his bloodstream, poisoning him from the inside out. His tiny organs, his kidneys, his liver, had begun to shut down. By the time he took his last breath, Sterling weighed less than he did the day he was born. His parents were Zachary Paul Koehn and Cheyenne Renee Harris. They lived in that apartment with Sterling. They ate meals there. They slept there. They watched TV, scrolled through their phones, went about their daily routines, and the whole time their infant son was dying in a swing just a few feet away. When detectives questioned them, neither Zachary nor Cheyenne could provide a reasonable explanation. They didn't claim they didn't know. They didn't say Sterling had been sick and they couldn't afford a doctor. They didn't say they'd been trying to help him. They just hadn't. It was neglect in its purest, most inexcusable form. Zachary Koehn was charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment, resulting in death. His trial was moved to Henry County due to intense pretrial publicity. Everyone in Alta Vista and the surrounding areas knew about Sterling. The case had made national headlines. People were horrified, outraged, demanding justice. The trial took place in November 2018. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the entomology report, the medical examiner's findings, the photos of the apartment, the unopened formula, the unused diapers. They walked the jury through Sterling's final days, the hunger, the dehydration, the pain, the slow, agonizing decline. The defense tried to argue that Zachary hadn't intended to kill Sterling, that it was neglect, not murder. But intent doesn't matter when your actions, or inactions, directly cause a child's death. The jury didn't need long to decide. After deliberating for approximately 1 hour, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment, resulting in death. Zachary Koehn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cheyenne Renee Harris was tried separately. Her trial was held in Plymouth County in January 2019. Her defense team took a different approach. They argued that Cheyenne had been suffering from postpartum depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and drug use. They painted her as a victim of her own mental health struggles, someone who had been overwhelmed and incapable of caring for Sterling the way she should have, but the prosecution wasn't having it. Yes, postpartum depression is real. Yes, mental health struggles are serious. But there's a line between struggling to care for a baby and letting that baby die in a maggot-infested diaper while formula and diapers sit unused just feet away. Cheyenne crossed that line. She had choices. She could have asked for help. She could have called a family member, a friend, a doctor, 911. She could have walked out the door and handed Sterling to a neighbor. She did none of those things. On February 6, 2019, the jury found Cheyenne Renee Harris guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She appealed the conviction in 2020, arguing ineffective counsel and procedural errors. The Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. Cheyenne Harris will never walk free again. Sterling Koehn's case became a landmark example of forensic entomology and criminal investigations. Dr. Huntington's testimony demonstrated how insect evidence can establish precise timelines, hold perpetrators accountable, and give a voice to victims who can't speak for themselves. Sterling couldn't tell investigators what happened to him, but the maggots could, and they did. Sterling should be 8 years old now. He should be starting 3rd grade, playing with friends, learning to ride a bike. Instead, he's buried in a small grave, a victim of 2 people who should have loved him and failed in every conceivable way. And his parents will spend the rest of their lives in prison, knowing exactly what they did. Case 4, Michelle Lynn Kehoe, Jesup, 2008. 7-year-old Sean Kehoe was kneeling on the ground near a remote pond in Buchanan County, Iowa. His mother stood behind him. She told him to stay still, to be quiet, to close his eyes. Then she pulled out a hunting knife and slit his throat from ear to ear. October 26, 2008, started like any other Sunday for the Kehoe family in Jesup. Michelle Lynn Kehoe was known around town as a devoted mother, an active church member, the kind of woman who volunteered at school events and always had a smile on her face. She had 2 sons, 7-year-old Sean and 2-year-old Seth. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect family. But that morning, Michelle loaded her boys into the car and drove them to a secluded pond off County Road X16 near Littleton. She had planned this. Days earlier, she had purchased a hunting knife. She brought duct tape with her. She knew exactly where she was going, a place so isolated that no one would hear the boys scream. When they arrived, Michelle made Sean get out of the car and kneel on the ground. She told him to stay still. Sean, trusting his mother the way every 7-year-old should be able to trust their parent, did what he was told. He knelt there, small and obedient, waiting. Michelle took the knife and drew it across his throat. The blade cut deep, slicing through skin, muscle, tissue. Blood poured from the wound. Sean collapsed, gasping, choking, his hands instinctively reaching for his neck as he tried to understand what had just happened. His mother, the person who was supposed to protect him, love him, keep him safe, had just tried to kill him. But Michelle wasn't done. She walked back to the car where 2-year-old Seth was still strapped in his car seat. He was too young to understand what was happening, too small to run or fight back. Michelle took the knife and cut his throat so deeply it nearly severed his windpipe. Seth's tiny body went limp, blood soaking through his clothes, his car seat, pooling on the floor of the vehicle. Then Michelle turned the knife on herself. But her wounds were different, shallow, hesitant, self-inflicted cuts on her neck that barely broke the skin. She wasn't trying to die. She was staging a scene. Michelle pulled out her phone and called 911. When the dispatcher answered, she was hysterical, screaming, barely coherent. She claimed a stranger had attacked them. She said a man had come out of nowhere, grabbed her boys and slashed their throats before attacking her. She begged for help, sobbing into the phone, playing the role of a terrified mother whose children had just been brutally assaulted. Emergency responders raced to the scene. When they arrived, they found Sean lying on the ground near the pond, his throat sliced open, covered in blood but still breathing. Seth was in the car, unresponsive, his injuries catastrophic. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize both boys and rush them to the hospital. Seth didn't make it. He died shortly after arrival, but Sean, against all odds, survived. And when he woke up in that hospital bed, he told investigators exactly what happened. Sean Kehoe, 7 years old, with bandages wrapped around his throat and a breathing tube still in place, testified against his own mother. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but every word was clear. He described the drive to the pond. He described kneeling on the ground. He described his mother standing behind him. He described the knife, the pain, the moment he realized it was her. He told investigators that his mother had told him to lie down and be quiet, that it would be over soon. There's something uniquely devastating about a child having to testify against their parent. Sean wasn't just a witness. He was a survivor of an attempted murder carried out by the one person he should have been able to trust unconditionally. And despite the trauma, despite the fear, despite everything he had been through, Sean told the truth. His testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Investigators quickly dismantled Michelle's story. There were no footprints at the scene other than hers and the boys, no tire tracks from another vehicle, no evidence of a stranger. Forensic analysis of Michelle's wounds showed they were shallow, hesitant, and self-inflicted, nothing like the deep, violent cuts inflicted on her sons. Blood spatter patterns were inconsistent with her version of events. And then there was the knife and duct tape, items she had purchased in advance, clear evidence of premeditation. Michelle Lynn Kehoe was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for Seth's death, attempted murder for the attack on Sean, and child endangerment resulting in serious injury. Her trial began in November 2009, and the courtroom was packed. People wanted to understand how a mother, a church volunteer, a woman who seemed so normal, could do something so monstrous. The defense tried to argue that Michelle had been suffering from severe depression and delusions. They claimed she believed killing her sons was an act of mercy, that she thought she was saving them from a world she perceived as dangerous and evil. They leaned heavily on an insanity defense, arguing that Michelle hadn't been in her right mind and couldn't distinguish right from wrong at the time of the attack. But the prosecution countered with evidence of planning and deliberation. She had purchased the weapon. She had chosen the location. She had staged her own injuries. She had lied to 911. Those weren't the actions of someone who was completely detached from reality. Those were the actions of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and tried to cover it up. The jury didn't buy the insanity defense. After hearing all the evidence, including Sean's heartbreaking testimony, they found Michelle Lynn Kehoe guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, attempted murder, and child endangerment resulting in serious injury. In January 2010, the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for Seth's murder, plus an additional 25 years for the attempted murder of Sean, plus 10 years for child endangerment. The attempted murder and child endangerment sentences were ordered to run consecutively, meaning Michelle would serve them one after the other. Not that it mattered. She was never getting out. Michelle appealed her conviction in 2011, arguing ineffective counsel and challenging Iowa's insanity defense laws. The Iowa Court of Appeals rejected every single argument and upheld the conviction. Michelle Lynn Kehoe will die in prison. The community of Jesup struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster who had slit her own son's throat and killed her toddler in cold blood. Mental health advocates emphasized that depression doesn't always look the way we expect, that people can smile and volunteer and seem fine while battling invisible demons, but they also noted that Michelle had access to resources. She had a support system, she had options, and she chose violence instead. Sean Kehoe survived, but he will carry the physical and emotional scars of what his mother did to him for the rest of his life. Seth never got the chance to grow up. He was 2 years old. He should be 19 now, finishing high school, thinking about college, building a future. Instead, he's buried in a cemetery, a victim of the person who was supposed to love him most. This is the kind of evil that makes you question everything. If you're still watching, drop a like and let me know in the comments. What time is it where you are right now? Case 5, Billie Rose Mosier. Ida County, 2023. Highway 175 between Ida Grove and Battle Creek, Iowa. May 4, 2023. Multiple drivers grabbed their phones and dialed 911, their voices frantic, all reporting the same horrifying sight. A small child was leaning so far out of the rear driver's side window of a moving sedan that half his body was outside the vehicle. The car was traveling at highway speed, 55, 60 miles per hour, and the little boy looked like he was struggling, his body twisted, caught in the window frame. His arms were flailing. Drivers passing by could see his face, see the panic, see that something was terribly, terribly wrong. One witness laid on her horn, honking repeatedly, trying to get the driver's attention. She pulled up alongside the sedan, waving her arms, pointing frantically at the back window. The driver, a woman, glanced over briefly. Their eyes met. The witness expected her to pull over immediately, to stop the car and check on the child. But the woman didn't stop. She just turned her head back to the road and kept driving. Other drivers tried the same thing, honking, flashing their lights, pulling alongside, and gesturing. Nothing worked. The sedan continued down the highway, the child still hanging out the window, still struggling, still trapped, and the driver just kept going. By the time police finally forced the vehicle to pull over, 3-year-old Jordan Reed was unresponsive. Officers rushed to the rear window and found his small body wedged in the frame. The window had been partially rolled up, trapping him in a position that compressed his airway. He had suffocated while his mother, Billie Rose Mosier, drove down the highway, ignoring the honking horns and frantic drivers trying to save her son's life. Paramedics attempted CPR on the side of the road, but it was too late. Jordan was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death: strangulation by window entrapment. His little body had been caught in that window, unable to breathe, slowly suffocating, as the car barreled down the highway, and his mother did nothing. When detectives questioned Mosier at the scene, she told them a story that made no sense. She claimed Jordan had strangled himself on the straps of his car seat. She said it was an accident, that she hadn't realized anything was wrong until police pulled her over. She acted confused, even a little indignant that officers were treating her like a suspect. But investigators didn't buy it. They examined the back seat of the car and immediately found inconsistencies. The car seat was unbuckled and pushed to the side, clearly unused. The straps weren't even around Jordan. They were dangling loose. The autopsy showed ligature marks on Jordan's neck that matched the window frame, not a car seat harness. There was no way Jordan had strangled himself on car seat straps. He had been leaning out of a partially open window, and when the window rolled up, either accidentally or intentionally, it trapped him, and Mosier kept driving. Detectives seized Mosier's phone, and what they found on it was damning. There were videos, multiple videos that Mosier herself had recorded showing Jordan roaming freely in the back seat, completely unbuckled, on various occasions. In some clips, he was climbing over the seats while the car was moving. In others, he was playing with the window controls, standing on the seat, leaning out of partially opened windows while the car was in motion. And in every single video, Mosier never intervened. She never stopped the car. She never buckled him in. She just kept driving, and in some cases kept filming. The videos painted a clear picture. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a tragic accident. This was a pattern of reckless, negligent behavior. Billie Rose Mosier routinely allowed her 3-year-old son to move around the car unsecured while traveling at highway speeds. She knew it was dangerous. She had recorded evidence of it on her own phone, and she did nothing to stop it. Jordan Reed should have been in a car seat, buckled in, safe. Iowa law is crystal clear. Children under 6 years old must be secured in an appropriate child restraint system. It's not a suggestion, it's the law, and it exists for one reason: to keep kids like Jordan alive. But Billie Rose Mosier didn't follow the law, and on May 4, 2023, her negligence killed her son. The case went to trial, but Mosier waived her right to a jury trial and opted for a bench trial, meaning a judge would decide her fate instead of a jury. The trial took place in front of Judge Jeffrey A. Neary, and the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented the 911 calls from the witnesses on Highway 175. They played the desperate voices of drivers who had tried to get Mosier's attention, who had honked and waved and done everything they could to make her stop. They showed the videos from Mosier's phone, the clips of Jordan unbuckled, climbing, playing with the windows. They brought in the medical examiner, who explained in detail how Jordan had died, slowly, painfully, trapped in that window while his mother ignored the chaos around her. The defense tried to argue that Mosier hadn't intended for Jordan to die, that she had been distracted, that she hadn't realized what was happening. But intent doesn't matter in a case like this. When you allow a 3-year-old to roam freely in a moving car, when you ignore multiple drivers honking and pointing at your child hanging out of a window, when you have videos on your phone proving this was a pattern, you're not just distracted, you're criminally negligent. On April 4, 2025, Judge Neary delivered his verdict, guilty of child endangerment resulting in death. On May 16, 2025, Mosier was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Under Iowa Code Section 902.12, she is required to serve a mandatory minimum of 70% of that sentence, 35 years, before she's even eligible for parole. She'll be in her 70s before she sees the outside of a prison again, if she ever does. The court also ordered Mosier to pay $150,000 in restitution under Iowa Code Section 910.3b, money that goes to Jordan's estate, a small symbolic acknowledgement of a life cut short. The community of Ada County was shaken. How does a mother ignore her child suffocating in a car window? How does she keep driving while witnesses are screaming at her to stop? The questions haunted everyone who followed the case. In response, local leaders launched an aggressive child passenger safety campaign. Fire departments and police stations began offering free car seat inspection events with certified technicians who could show parents how to properly install and use car seats. Schools brought in speakers to educate families about Iowa's car seat laws. Pediatricians started incorporating car seat safety checks into routine well-child visits, making sure every parent understood the risks and knew how to keep their children safe. Flyers were distributed in English and Spanish, reaching immigrant communities who might not be familiar with Iowa's specific laws. The message was simple but urgent: buckle your kids in, every time, no exceptions. Because one moment of negligence, one decision to let a child roam free in a moving car, can end in tragedy. Jordan Reed was 3 years old. He should be starting kindergarten now, learning to read, making friends, riding bikes, growing up. Instead, he's buried in a cemetery, a victim of his mother's reckless disregard for his safety. And Billie Rose Mosier will spend the next several decades behind bars, knowing that all she had to do was stop the car. What's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Rainy? Drop it in the comments. Case 6, Tresa Marie Rains, Ankeny, 2007, April 15, 2007. Ankeny, Iowa. A frantic 911 call came in just after 3 in the morning. Tresa Marie Rains was on the line, hysterical, barely able to get the words out. "My baby, she's not breathing, she won't wake up. Please, you have to help me." The dispatcher stayed on the line, walking Tresa through CPR steps, while paramedics raced to the address. When they arrived, they found 5-month-old Zara Carmen Yemen lying in her crib, unresponsive. Her tiny body was already cold. They started resuscitation efforts immediately, but it was clear she had been gone for a while. Zara was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. Tresa sobbed in the waiting room, surrounded by family members who tried to comfort her. This was every parent's worst nightmare, waking up to find your baby gone. No warning, no explanation, just a healthy infant one moment and a lifeless body the next. The Polk County medical examiner performed an autopsy, searching for answers. They examined Zara's tiny body from head to toe, looking for signs of trauma, illness, or injury. They found nothing. No bruises, no broken bones, no internal bleeding, no visible cause of death. Her organs appeared normal. There were no signs of suffocation, no petechiae, the tiny burst blood vessels that sometimes appear when someone is smothered. There was nothing to indicate foul play. The medical examiner ruled Zara's death as sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. It's a diagnosis that gets applied when a seemingly healthy baby dies unexpectedly and no clear cause can be determined, even after a thorough investigation and autopsy. It's devastating, but it happens. Thousands of families every year lose babies to SIDS, and doctors still don't fully understand why. Zara's paternal grandparents, Michael and Melanie Yaman, were heartbroken. They had adored their granddaughter, and now she was gone. They buried her in a small ceremony, grieving what they believed was a tragic but natural death, the kind of inexplicable loss that shatters families but leaves no one to blame. The case was closed. Life, painfully, moved on. For 2 years, Tresa Raines walked free, went to work, lived her life, saw friends, celebrated birthdays and holidays. While Zara's grandparents mourned what they thought was a tragic accident, the truth was so much worse. In September 2009, more than 2 years after Zara's death, an acquaintance of Tresa Raines contacted the Ankeny Police Department. The caller told detectives that Tresa had been acting strangely, making odd, unsettling comments about Zara's death. She had hinted more than once that maybe it hadn't been SIDS after all, that maybe there was more to the story. The acquaintance was disturbed enough to pick up the phone and report it. Detectives reopened the investigation immediately. They brought Tresa in for questioning, and this time they pressed harder. They asked her to walk them through the night Zara died, minute by minute. They asked about her mental state, her relationship with Zara, whether she had been struggling. And under the pressure of that interrogation room, the walls closing in, the weight of the lie becoming too heavy to carry, Tresa Raines broke. She confessed. Tresa told investigators that on the night of April 15, 2007, Zara had been crying. Not unusual for a 5-month-old baby's cry. It's how they communicate. But that night, Tresa said, the crying felt unbearable. Zara wouldn't stop. She screamed, and Tresa couldn't take it anymore. She snapped. Tresa grabbed a pillow, walked over to Zara's crib, and pressed it over her daughter's face. She held it there. Zara's little body squirmed beneath the pillow, her tiny arms and legs kicking, fighting for air that wouldn't come. Tresa kept pressing. She held that pillow down until Zara stopped moving, until she stopped breathing, until she was dead. Then Tresa removed the pillow, placed it back where it belonged, and waited. She waited long enough to make sure Zara was cold, long enough to make the timeline believable. Then she called 911, hysterical, playing the role of a devastated mother who had just discovered her baby unresponsive in the crib. And it worked, because Zara was so small, so defenseless. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises on her face from the pillow, no scratches, no broken blood vessels in her eyes. The very thing that made her an easy victim, her size, her inability to fight back, was the same thing that allowed Tresa to get away with murder for 2 years. Detectives were stunned. They had closed the case as SIDS. The medical examiner had found no evidence of foul play, and all along Tresa had been living with the knowledge that she had killed her own daughter and blamed it on a mysterious, unexplainable syndrome. Tresa Marie Raines was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but during plea negotiations, her defense team worked out a deal with prosecutors. In 2010, Tresa pleaded guilty to child endangerment, resulting in death, a lesser charge than first-degree murder, but still one that carried serious consequences. The plea deal spared the Yaman family the trauma of a prolonged trial and guaranteed that Tresa would spend decades behind bars. In exchange for the guilty plea, Tresa was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Under Iowa's mandatory minimum sentencing laws, she'll have to serve at least 35 years, 70% of her sentence, before she's even eligible for parole. She'll be an old woman by the time she's released, if she's released at all. At the sentencing hearing, Zara's paternal grandparents, Michael and Melanie Yaman, delivered victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Michael spoke first. He described the image that haunted him every single day: Zara's tiny face covered by a pillow, her mother's hands pressing down, her little lungs struggling for air that never came. He talked about the betrayal, not just of Zara, but of everyone who had loved her and believed her death was natural. For 2 years they had grieved an accident. Now they had to grieve a murder. Melanie Yaman spoke about the perpetual, suffocating grief of losing a grandchild. She described holding Zara, feeding her, watching her smile and coo and grow. She talked about the nursery they had set up at their house so Zara could visit, the toys they had bought, the future they had imagined. And then she talked about learning, 2 years after Zara's death, that it wasn't Sid's, it wasn't mysterious, it wasn't God's plan or fate or bad luck, it was murder. And the person who did it, the person they had comforted, supported and mourned alongside, was Tresa. Tresa offered a brief apology at sentencing. She said she was sorry, that she had been overwhelmed, that she hadn't known what else to do, but she provided no real explanation for why she chose violence over putting Zara down and walking away, why she chose murder over calling a friend, a family member, a crisis hotline, why she chose to smother her own daughter instead of asking for help. The case sent shockwaves through Ankeny and the wider medical community. Pediatric clinics across the city and throughout Iowa began emphasizing mandatory safe sleep education for all new parents. They distributed pamphlets on how to handle crying babies, how to recognize when you're at your breaking point, and what resources are available when you feel overwhelmed. Child welfare agencies incorporated the case into their training modules, teaching social workers and investigators to look deeper, ask harder questions, and never assume that a lack of visible injuries means a death was natural. Medical examiners across Iowa took note as well. SIDS is real, but it can also be a convenient mask for suffocation when there are no external injuries. Investigators are now trained to be more skeptical, to push for confessions, and to revisit cases when new information comes to light. Zara Carmen Yaman was 5 months old when her mother killed her. She should be 18 now, graduating high school, thinking about college, planning her future. Instead, she's buried in a cemetery, her life stolen by the one person who should have protected her above all else. And Tresa Marie Rains will spend the next several decades in a prison cell, carrying the weight of what she did, and the 2 years she spent pretending it never happened. Case 7. Maria Bianca Balderas and Jorge Perez, Iowa City, 2012. April 30th, 2012. Paramedics responded to a 911 call at an Iowa City apartment reporting an unresponsive toddler. When they arrived, they found 20-month-old Marcus Balderas lying on the floor, cold and lifeless. They started CPR immediately, working frantically, but it was clear the moment they touched his small body that he had been gone for a while. As they examined Marcus, they began noticing things that made their stomachs turn. Bruises, everywhere, on his head, his face, his back, his stomach. His little body was covered in marks that told a story paramedics had seen too many times before. This wasn't an accident, this was abuse. Marcus was pronounced dead at the scene. His body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where the full extent of the horror was revealed. The autopsy findings were devastating. Marcus had multiple rib fractures at different stages of healing, meaning he had been injured repeatedly over weeks or months. Some ribs were freshly broken, others had started to heal, only to be broken again. He had subdural hemorrhages, bleeding in the brain caused by violent shaking or blunt force trauma to the head. His liver showed signs of damage from being struck. His diaphragm, the muscle that helps you breathe, was torn, and there were bruises covering nearly every part of his body. The medical examiner's conclusion was unequivocal. The injury pattern was inconsistent with any accidental fall or normal childhood injury. This was intentional, sustained, brutal violence inflicted on a toddler who couldn't defend himself, couldn't fight back, couldn't escape. Marcus lived with his mother, 18-year-old Maria Bianca Balderas, and her boyfriend Jorge Perez. Detectives brought them both in for questioning, and what they learned in those interrogation rooms painted a picture of two people who saw a crying toddler, not as a child in need of comfort, but as an inconvenience to be silenced by any means necessary. Jorge Perez confessed first. He admitted to striking Marcus repeatedly with his knuckles, closed fist punches to a 20-month-old baby. He admitted to stepping on Marcus with his full body weight, pressing down on the toddler's small frame while Marcus cried and gasped beneath him. He admitted to smothering Marcus under a pillow multiple times when Marcus cried too much, holding the pillow over his face until the crying stopped. But here's what made the case even more disturbing. Maria Bianca Balderas wasn't just a passive bystander. She was an active participant. Detectives seized both of their phones and found a trail of text messages exchanged between Balderas and Perez that revealed the depth of their cruelty. In those messages, Balderas instructed Perez on how to hit Marcus without leaving visible marks. She told him where to strike so bruises wouldn't show up easily, so doctors wouldn't ask questions, so they could keep hurting Marcus without getting caught. She admitted in the texts that she had covered Marcus's face with her hands to quiet him when he wouldn't stop crying. She acknowledged that Marcus had bruises and suggested that Perez hit him on the bottom or other areas less likely to be seen during routine checkups. The texts weren't frantic or panicked. They were calculated, cold, strategic. This wasn't a case of two overwhelmed parents losing control in a moment of frustration. This was a sustained campaign of abuse, documented in their own words, carried out over weeks or months while Marcus suffered in silence. Prosecutors moved quickly. Jorge Perez was charged with child endangerment resulting in death. During plea negotiations, Perez agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a 50-year prison sentence. In June 2015, he was sentenced and sent to an Iowa state prison, where he'll remain for decades. Under Iowa's mandatory minimum sentencing laws, he'll have to serve at least 35 years, 70% of his sentence, before he's eligible for parole. Maria Bianca Balderas's case took a different path. She was charged with neglect of a dependent person and 3 counts of child endangerment resulting in bodily injury. Her defense team argued that she had been suffering from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. They painted her as a young mother who had been emotionally manipulated and controlled by Perez, someone who was more victim than perpetrator. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. The text messages didn't show a victim. They showed someone who was directing the abuse, instructing her boyfriend on how to hurt her son without getting caught, admitting that she herself had covered Marcus's face to stop his crying. That's not the behavior of someone being manipulated. That's the behavior of someone actively participating in the abuse of their own child. In January 2016, Balderas entered an Alford plea to the charges. An Alford plea is a legal mechanism where a defendant maintains their innocence but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. It's a way of pleading guilty without actually saying the words, "I did it." Balderas was sentenced to 25 years, with 15 years suspended on probation. Effectively, she served 10 years in custody before being released, and that's where the controversy begins. Jorge Perez received 50 years. Maria Bianca Balderas effectively served 10. Despite the fact that text messages showed she participated in and directed the abuse, despite the fact that she admitted to covering Marcus's face, despite the fact that Marcus was her son and she had a duty to protect him. Victim advocates, child welfare organizations, and members of the public were outraged. How could two people who were equally complicit in the abuse and death of a toddler receive such wildly different sentences? The disparity reignited a long-standing debate about whether mothers are treated more leniently in child abuse cases, even when the evidence suggests equal culpability. Some argued that Balderas's youth, her mental health struggles, and the power dynamic with Perez justified the lighter sentence. Others argued that being a mother carries additional responsibility, and that Balderas's role in orchestrating the abuse made her just as guilty, if not more so, than Perez. The case also had a significant impact on the medical and academic communities. University of Iowa medical staff who had worked on Marcus's autopsy published a case study in a pediatric journal highlighting the importance of recognizing patterns of abuse. They emphasized the role of forensic pathology in identifying repeated injuries, the value of multidisciplinary child death review teams, and the need to train doctors and nurses to spot the signs of ongoing abuse, even when parents offer plausible explanations for individual injuries. Marcus Balderas was 20 months old when he died. He was just starting to talk, to walk with confidence, to develop his personality. He should be 13 years old now, in middle school, playing sports, hanging out with friends, living the life every child deserves. Instead, he's buried in a small grave, a victim of two people who should have loved him and protected him but chose violence instead. Jorge Perez will spend the next several decades in prison. Maria Bianca Balderas has already been released, her sentence reduced, her freedom restored. Whether that's justice or a failure of the system is a question that continues to haunt everyone who followed this case. These cases are hard to hear, but they're important. If you think this content matters, hit subscribe and share this video. Someone needs to hear these stories. Case 8. Megan K. Staude and Rodney S. Staude, Norwalk, 2022. Concealed pregnancy, home birth. A newborn baby boy placed in a cardboard box for 2 days, alone, crying, cold, unfed. Then a plastic trash bag tied shut, tossed in a roadside ditch like garbage. The baby wouldn't stop moving when we put him in the bag. That's what the text messages said. Messages exchanged between 25-year-old Megan K. Staude and her 64-year-old father, Rodney A. Staude. Messages that confirmed what investigators already suspected. The baby had been alive when they sealed him in that bag. He had struggled, he had fought for air, and they watched him die. Late February 2022. Megan Staude gave birth at home in Norwalk, Iowa. She had concealed the pregnancy for 9 months. No prenatal appointments, no ultrasounds, no disclosure to coworkers or friends. She worked her shifts, went about her daily routine, and never told a soul she was pregnant. When labor began, she was alone. She delivered the baby by herself, in her home, with no medical assistance. The baby was healthy, full term, breathing, alive. Megan wrapped him in a towel, placed him inside a cardboard box and left him there. No blanket, no bottle, no warmth, just a box, in a room, with a newborn baby who cried intermittently, desperately trying to signal that he needed help. The baby stayed in that box for 2 days, 48 hours. No food, no water, no comfort, just darkness and cold, and the sound of his own cries echoing in the silence. On February 26, 2022, Megan made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding the baby. She couldn't keep pretending he didn't exist. So she and her father, Rodney, decided to get rid of him, not by surrendering him to a hospital, not by calling 911, not by leaving him at a fire station where he'd be found and cared for. They decided to throw him away. They took the baby, still alive, still breathing, and placed him inside a plastic trash bag. The text messages recovered later confirmed it. The baby wouldn't stop moving when we put him in the bag. That movement wasn't random. It was a baby fighting for his life, his tiny lungs gasping for oxygen that wasn't there, his small body instinctively struggling against suffocation. The baby survived for several minutes inside that bag before his oxygen ran out. Then his movements stopped, his heart stopped, and he died. Megan and Rodney tied the bag shut, drove to a roadside ditch along Delaware Street in Norwalk, and tossed it out like they were disposing of trash on the way home from a fast food restaurant. Then they went back to their lives. Megan returned to work. Rodney went about his day, and the baby, who was never given a name, never held with love, never had a chance, lay in that ditch, hidden in a plastic bag, his tiny body beginning to decompose. March 8, 2022, 10 days after the baby had been abandoned. Megan's coworkers started asking questions. They noticed she looked different. Her body had changed. She seemed physically drained, pale, exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired from work. One coworker finally asked directly, "Were you pregnant?" Megan broke. She admitted it. Yes, she had been pregnant. Yes, she had given birth. And no, the baby wasn't okay. Her coworkers immediately contacted police. Detectives arrived and questioned Megan. She confessed to everything: the concealed pregnancy, the home birth, the cardboard box, the plastic bag, the ditch. She told them where they could find the baby's body. On March 9, 2022, investigators brought in a cadaver dog and searched the area Megan had described. The dog led them straight to the plastic trash bag in the ditch along Delaware Street. Inside, they found the baby's tiny body. He was partially decomposed but still recognizable, still unmistakably a newborn, still someone's child, even if his own mother had treated him like he was nothing. The autopsy confirmed what investigators already knew. The baby had died from exposure, suffocation, and neglect. He had been alive when placed in the bag, and he had died alone, in the dark, struggling for air that never came. Megan K. Staude was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but during plea negotiations, prosecutors agreed to reduce the charge to second-degree murder in exchange for a guilty plea. In July 2024, Megan pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison with a mandatory minimum of 35 years under Iowa Code Section 902.12. She won't be eligible for parole until she's in her 60s. Rodney A. Staude, Megan's father, was initially deemed incompetent to stand trial, but after receiving treatment, he was later found competent to proceed. In late 2025, Rodney pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was also sentenced to 50 years in prison with a mandatory minimum of 35 years. He's 64 years old. He'll likely die behind bars. At sentencing, a statement was read on behalf of Zach Wilson, the baby's biological father. He described being totally and emotionally broken by the loss of a son he never got to meet. A child whose life was stolen before it ever really began. A baby who should have been safe, loved, and protected but was instead thrown away like trash. The case devastated the Norwalk community. People couldn't understand how a mother could give birth and then discard her baby like he was nothing. How a grandfather could help his daughter murder his own grandchild. How two people could live with themselves after sealing a living, breathing newborn in a plastic bag and leaving him to die in a ditch. But the community didn't just mourn, they took action. By November 2025, Norwalk firefighters installed Iowa's third safe haven baby box at 1100 Chatham Avenue. The community raised $15,000 to fund the project. The box is temperature-controlled, alarmed, and completely anonymous. Parents can surrender infants up to 90 days old, no questions asked. The moment a baby is placed inside, sensors detect it, and emergency personnel respond within minutes. The baby is immediately taken to a hospital, checked by doctors, and placed in the care of social services. The parent faces no legal consequences. A safe haven baby box is temperature-controlled, alarmed, anonymous. Parents can surrender infants up to 90 days old, no questions asked. Megan and Rodney lived near one. They chose violence instead. The box was dedicated in memory of the unnamed Norwalk infant, a small piece of hope born from an unspeakable tragedy, a tangible reminder that there are options, that no parent has to make the choice Megan and Rodney made, that help is available, that a baby's life is worth more than a plastic bag in a ditch. Iowa's safe haven law has been in place for years. It was expanded in recent years to allow parents to surrender infants up to 90 days old, 3 full months, at hospitals, fire stations, police stations, or safe haven baby boxes. No names, no paperwork, no criminal charges, just safety for a child who deserves a chance at life. Megan Staude knew about these options. She worked in the community. She had access to the internet, to friends, to coworkers. She could have called 911. She could have driven to a hospital and left the baby at the entrance. She could have knocked on a neighbor's door and handed him over. She chose none of those things. She chose a cardboard box, a plastic bag, and a ditch. The baby, who was never publicly named, was buried in a private ceremony. He had no first birthday, no first steps, no first words, no chance to grow, to love, to live. His entire existence was 48 hours in a cardboard box and several agonizing minutes in a plastic bag, fighting for air that never came. Megan K. Staude and Rodney A. Staude will spend the next several decades in prison, their names forever attached to one of the most heartbreaking cases of child abandonment and murder in Iowa history. And the Norwalk Safe Haven Baby Box stands as a testament to a community that decided one lost life was one too many. Case 9, Jackie Burkle, Huxley, 2012, January 7, 2012. Jackie Burkle didn't show up for her shift at Casey's General Store in Huxley, Iowa. Her manager tried calling. No answer. Sent text messages. Nothing. Stopped by her house on the way home. No response. For someone who had been a reliable employee, this was unusual, concerning. The manager requested a welfare check. When police arrived at Jackie's home and knocked on the door, she answered. She looked unwell, pale, exhausted, disoriented. Officers asked if she was okay, if something had happened. Jackie hesitated. She seemed nervous, her eyes darting around, her hands fidgeting. Then officers noticed signs that made them ask a question they weren't expecting to ask. Have you recently given birth? Jackie's face changed. The color drained. She nodded slowly. Yes, she admitted. She had given birth. Where's the baby? An officer asked. Jackie didn't answer with words. She walked outside to her car parked in the driveway. Officers followed, unsure what they were about to see. Jackie stopped at the trunk, placed her hand on the lid, and paused. Then she opened it. Inside, wrapped carefully side by side in blankets, were the bodies of 2 newborn baby girls, twin daughters, dead. Paramedics were called immediately. They confirmed what officers already knew. Both babies had been deceased for at least a day, possibly longer. Their small bodies were cold, their skin discolored. There was no saving them. They were gone. Jackie Burkle was 22 years old. She had concealed her pregnancy for 9 months. No one knew, not her coworkers who saw her nearly every day, not her parents who lived in the same town. not even the baby's father. Jackie worked her shifts, went about her life, and never told a soul she was pregnant. She didn't see a doctor. She didn't have prenatal care. She didn't prepare a nursery, or buy baby clothes, or make any plans for what would happen when the babies arrived. On January 6, 2012, Jackie went into labor. She was alone at home. She gave birth to twin girls by herself, with no medical assistance, no one to help her, no one even aware of what was happening. The twins were born alive, full term, breathing, two tiny perfect baby girls who had just entered the world. Jackie wrapped them in blankets, carried them outside to her car, and placed them side by side in the trunk. Then she closed the lid and walked away. The next day, when she didn't show up for work, her manager made the call that led police to her door, and by the time officers opened that trunk, both babies were dead. The medical examiner conducted autopsies on both infants. The findings were consistent with intentional harm. The cause of death was listed as suffocation or blunt force head trauma, injuries that don't happen naturally during or after childbirth. The babies hadn't died from complications. They hadn't been stillborn. They had been alive, and then they were killed. The examiner couldn't determine with absolute certainty whether Jackie had suffocated them, struck them, or both. But the conclusion was clear. These deaths were homicides. Jackie Burkle was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Under Iowa law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. If convicted on both counts, Jackie would spend the rest of her life behind bars with no chance of ever walking free. But the case never went to trial. In August 2012, Jackie's defense team negotiated a plea deal with prosecutors. Jackie agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder in exchange for the state dropping the first-degree murder charges. It was a deal that spared Jackie from a mandatory life sentence and spared the state the time and expense of a trial. On August 23, 2012, Jackie stood in front of a judge and pleaded guilty to killing her newborn twin daughters. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent 50-year prison terms. Concurrent means the sentences run at the same time, not one after the other. Under Iowa's mandatory minimum sentencing laws, Jackie will have to serve at least 35 years, 70% of her sentence, before she's eligible for parole. She'll be in her late 50s at the earliest possible release date. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Jackie's youth and the possibility of untreated mental health issues. The defense argued that Jackie had been overwhelmed, terrified, isolated, and didn't know what to do. But the judge also emphasized that Jackie had multiple opportunities to seek help. She could have gone to a hospital during labor. She could have called 911 after the babies were born. She could have driven to a fire station, a police station, or a safe haven drop-off location and surrendered the babies legally and anonymously. Iowa's safe haven law, which had been in place since 2001, allowed parents to relinquish newborns up to 14 days old at designated locations without facing criminal charges. Jackie lived near a police station. She had options. She chose none of them. The case took an unexpected turn when Jackie's manager at Casey's General Store, the woman who had requested the welfare check that led to the discovery of the babies, alleged that she had been fired for making the call. She claimed that after police found the twins and arrested Jackie, Casey's terminated her employment in retaliation for involving law enforcement and bringing negative attention to the store. The manager filed a wrongful termination lawsuit, sparking a public outcry over whistleblower protections for employees who report concerns about child welfare. The lawsuit brought attention to a troubling question: should employees face consequences for trying to help someone, even if that help leads to a criminal investigation? Advocates argued that managers, co-workers, teachers, and other community members should be protected, even encouraged to request welfare checks when they're concerned about someone's well-being. Punishing someone for doing the right thing, they said, sends a chilling message that could prevent future interventions and cost lives. The twins were never publicly named. Their father, whose identity was not disclosed, was reportedly unaware of the pregnancy. The girls were buried together in a private ceremony, their lives reduced to a few brief hours before being extinguished by the person who should have protected them. The case prompted local leaders in Huxley and surrounding communities to launch a safe delivery education campaign. Pastors, teachers, healthcare providers, and social workers distributed information reminding residents of Iowa's safe haven law. Flyers were posted in schools, libraries, churches, and community centers. The message was simple and urgent: if you're pregnant and scared, there are options. You don't have to do this alone, and you don't have to hurt your child. Public service announcements emphasized that parents could surrender newborns up to 14 days old, later expanded to 90 days, at hospitals, fire stations, and police departments with complete anonymity and no legal repercussions. Crisis pregnancy centers offered free counseling, medical care, and adoption services. Hotlines were promoted for parents in distress, emphasizing that reaching out for help is not a sign of weakness, it's an act of courage that can save a life. But none of that could bring back the twin girls Jackie Burkle killed. They never took a first breath outside that trunk. They never felt the warmth of the sun or heard a lullaby or experienced the safety of being held by someone who loved them. Their entire existence was measured in hours, and their deaths were entirely preventable. Jackie Burkle is currently incarcerated in an Iowa state prison. She will remain there for decades, her name forever linked to one of the most heartbreaking cases of neonatal homicide in Iowa history. The twin girls she killed are buried together, two small graves side by side, a reminder of lives that should have been lived and a mother who chose violence over hope. If you've made it this far, you're part of a community that believes in justice. Comment below. What's one thing you want to see change in the child welfare system? Case 10, Alicia Marie Ritenour, Oskaloosa, 2014. May 11, 2014. 911 dispatch received a frantic call from an Oskaloosa, Iowa residence. A woman was screaming, barely coherent, saying her daughter wasn't breathing. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed inside. They found 18-month-old Ava Ritenour lying on the bedroom floor, covered by a blanket, her small body cold and unresponsive. They immediately began resuscitation efforts, working desperately to save her. But as they examined Ava more closely, they saw injuries that made their hearts sink. Severe trauma to her head, bruising, swelling, her skull felt unstable under their hands. This wasn't a case of a child who had stopped breathing from an illness or choking. This was blunt force trauma. This was violence. Ava was transported to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy and documented injuries so severe they were difficult to comprehend. Ava had 4 to 5 skull fractures, the kind of injuries you'd see in a high-speed car accident or a fall from multiple stories. Her brain had suffered massive hemorrhaging. The trauma was catastrophic, inflicted with such force that survival was never an option. Investigators went back to the house and began piecing together what had happened. They walked through the home, documenting the scene, looking for anything that might explain how an 18-month-old sustained injuries consistent with a car crash while inside her own bedroom. On the kitchen counter, they found a prepared bottle of formula, untouched, still full, like someone had made it but never fed it to Ava, like someone had gone through the motions of caring for a child without actually doing it. Detectives questioned Ava's mother, Alicia Marie Ritenour, who was 24 years old. Her story didn't add up. She claimed Ava had fallen, that it was an accident, that she didn't know how the injuries had gotten so severe. But the medical examiner's findings made it clear. These were not injuries from a simple fall. These were injuries from repeated brutal blows to the head. Someone had struck Ava with tremendous force, over and over, until her skull shattered. Investigators dug deeper into Ava's life. They found that Ava had missed multiple pediatric appointments over the months leading up to her death. Routine checkups that should have flagged health concerns, developmental delays, or signs of abuse. But Alicia never brought her in. When doctors' offices called to reschedule, she made excuses or didn't answer. Neighbors were interviewed. Several admitted they had heard shouting coming from the Ritenour home in the days and weeks before Ava's death. Loud voices, a child crying, sounds of anger and chaos. But no one called the police. No one requested a welfare check. They heard something wrong and did nothing, and Ava paid the price. Alicia Marie Ritenour was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death. Her trial took place in 2015, and the evidence presented was overwhelming. Prosecutors showed the jury photos of Ava's injuries, the autopsy report, the timeline of missed medical appointments, and the inconsistencies in Alicia's story. The defense tried to argue that Ava's injuries could have been accidental, that Alicia had been overwhelmed and struggling, that she hadn't intended to kill her daughter. But the forensic evidence told a different story. You don't accidentally inflict 4 to 5 skull fractures on a toddler. The jury found Alicia guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It seemed like the case was closed. Justice had been served. Ava's killer would spend the rest of her life behind bars. But in 2018, the Iowa Court of Appeals overturned Alicia's conviction. The appellate court ruled that Alicia's trial attorney had provided ineffective assistance of counsel. Her lawyer had failed to challenge key pieces of evidence, failed to call expert witnesses who could have offered alternative explanations for Ava's injuries, and failed to adequately prepare for trial. The court determined that these failures had violated Alicia's constitutional right to a fair trial. The conviction was vacated, and the case was sent back for retrial. Victim advocates and members of the community were devastated. Ava's family had believed the case was over. They had begun to move forward, to grieve, to try to heal. Now they were being told they'd have to go through it all over again. Another trial, another round of testimony, another chance for Alicia to walk free. But the state wasn't giving up. Prosecutors prepared for a retrial, ready to present the same evidence, the same expert testimony, the same damning timeline. And Alicia's new defense team, knowing the strength of the case against her, began negotiating a plea deal. In 2019, Alicia Marie Ritenour entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder in exchange for the state dropping the first-degree murder charge. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison with a mandatory minimum of 35 years under Iowa Code Section 902.12. She won't be eligible for parole until she's in her late 50s. Justice isn't always straightforward. Ava's case went through trial, conviction, appeal, and retrial. But one thing never changed. Ava is gone, and Alicia Ritenour is behind bars. The case exposed significant gaps in Iowa's child welfare system. Ava had missed multiple pediatric appointments, yet no one followed up. No social worker knocked on the door. No caseworker investigated why a toddler was falling through the cracks. Neighbors heard shouting and a child crying but didn't call for help. The warning signs were there, flashing like neon lights, and no one acted. In response, Mahaska County implemented sweeping reforms. Pediatric clinics across Oskaloosa and surrounding communities established mandatory follow-up protocols for missed appointments. If a child misses 2 consecutive well-child visits, the clinic now flags the case and contacts local child protective services. Social workers are required to make wellness calls to families, offering support, resources, and, when necessary, conducting home visits to ensure children are safe. Law enforcement and community leaders launched a public awareness campaign encouraging neighbors to trust their instincts. If you hear something that concerns you, a child crying for prolonged periods, shouting, sounds of violence, call 911, ask for a welfare check. Don't assume someone else will do it. Don't convince yourself it's none of your business. A 5-minute phone call can save a life. Schools, churches, and community centers began distributing information about recognizing signs of child abuse and neglect. Flyers listed warning signs, unexplained injuries, frequent absences, fearfulness, withdrawal, developmental delays. Hotlines were promoted for anonymous reporting, emphasizing that it's always better to call and be wrong than to stay silent and be right. The Iowa Department of Human Services incorporated Ava's case into mandatory training for social workers, healthcare providers, and educators. The training emphasizes the importance of proactive outreach, interagency communication, and the role of community members in child protection. Ava's death became a case study in what happens when systems fail and communities remain silent. Ava Ritenour was 18 months old when she died. She should be 11 years old now, starting middle school, discovering hobbies, building friendships, learning who she wanted to be. Instead, she's buried in a small grave in Oskaloosa, her life cut short by the person who was supposed to protect her. Alicia Marie Ritenour is incarcerated in an Iowa State prison. She has decades left on her sentence. She'll be an old woman before she's even considered for parole if that day ever comes. And every day she spends behind bars is a reminder that she had a choice. She could have asked for help. She could have called a family member, a doctor, a crisis hotline. She could have surrendered Ava to someone who would care for her. She chose violence instead. The reforms that followed Ava's death won't bring her back, but they might save the next child. They might catch the warning signs before it's too late. They might give a voice to a toddler who can't speak for themselves. And that's the only justice Ava will ever get. 10 mothers, 10 children who deserved better. Natalie, Yemissi, Sterling, Sean and Seth, Jordan, Zara, Marcus, the unnamed Norwalk infant, the Huxley twins, Ava. Their names, or the absence of names, represent lives stolen by the people who should have loved them most. The common threads are impossible to ignore. Every single one of these deaths was preventable. Iowa's safe haven law existed in every one of these cases, offering parents a legal, anonymous way to surrender infants without fear of prosecution. Safe haven baby boxes, fire stations, hospitals, police departments, options were available. But these mothers chose violence instead. The state of Iowa didn't look the other way. Life without parole, 50-year sentences with mandatory 35-year minimums. Iowa's sentencing laws are among the strictest in the nation when it comes to crimes against children, and these cases prove the courts take child endangerment and murder seriously. But punishment alone doesn't prevent the next tragedy. That's why communities across Iowa responded with action. Safe haven baby boxes were installed in Norwalk and beyond. Child safety campaigns flooded pediatric clinics, schools, and community centers. The Department of Human Services reformed protocols requiring follow-ups for missed appointments and proactive wellness checks, forensic innovation, entomology in Sterling's case, digital evidence in Marcus's case, refined medical examiner protocols in Ava's case, gave a voice to victims who couldn't speak for themselves. These 10 women will never walk free again.
and the children they killed will never get the chance to grow up. These stories are painful, but they're necessary. If you believe in holding perpetrators accountable and protecting vulnerable children, subscribe to Crimes Explained, share this video, and leave a comment telling me which case shocked you the most. I'll see you in the next one.